The Magic in the Marrow by Tygermine, read by Max Mabella. Chapter 3. Everything leaves a mark. She was killed by the Avada curse, Hermione stated as they stood over the skeletal remains of the victim. That's impossible to determine. It does not leave a mark, countered Malfoy across the table from her. Not on the outside, but if you look here, the microfractures along the base of the skull and first vertebrae. What the Avada curse does is sever the spinal cord here, and the surrounding magical energy expands, which pushes against the bones, causing the fractures. Malfoy leaned on the table, his arms straight and tense, shoulders hunching up. Why would a muggle get Avada'd? I don't know. We did a DNA backtrace, and there is nothing that connects her to magic in any way as far back as we have records. Malcolm felt the need to add to Hermione's statement. There's virtually no trace evidence to tell us where she was killed and stored either. Malfoy did a double take. Stored? She had to be kept somewhere after she was killed, but before she was dumped. Her bones show signs of flesh removal. It's like she was autopsied, flayed, and then dumped. Malcolm shot a side glance to Hermione, and she nodded with approval. Malfoy groaned. Merlin's balls. Now I have to go get the Muggle authorities involved. There is such a bunch of pillocks. It also doesn't make sense, Malfoy continued. Killed by magic, cut up by Muggle means, disposed of in Diagon Alley. This killer is using the line between the Muggle and the magical world like a jump rope. They stood around the examination table in silence, each trying to connect the evidence into some cohesive story that would make sense. A Patronus in the shape of an eagle flew into the lab and settled on the skull of the victim. Auror Inspector Malfoy, we found another body in Wiltshire, a few miles from your manor. My mother's house? He turned to Hermione. I moved out years ago. Got a nice little townhouse in Cotswolds. Hermione wasn't too sure what to do with that information or how to react to it, so she collected her field kit from her office and side-along apparated with Malfoy to the crime scene. Do you think they're related? Malfoy and Hermione, along with a selection of other Aurors, including Auror Caxton, were standing in a damp field. Rain clouds were slowly dispersing above them. In the distance loomed the Malfoy manor. Hermione made sure to keep her back to it during her examination, to not get distracted. No, this is a male. The facial structure suggests African descent. I mean, are we looking at a possible serial killer? Draco tucked his thumb into his belt, arms akimbo. Hermione glanced up at him and caught herself staring at his fingers splayed wide along his hips, framing that awful belt buckle of his. Her mouth went dry and she licked her lips. Gods, those fingers! Her mind pulled up flashes of what those fingers had been capable of in her dreams the night before. Granger? Malfoy's tone was concerned. Granger! She blinked rapidly, coming back into the present. I can't, determine a link there. Right. Malfoy nodded and turned to the gathered Aurors. You heard her. To the lab. Hermione moved away from the remains and peeled off her gloves, looking off into the distance. Where did you go? Malfoy sidled up to her, careful to ensure the manor stayed out of sight. Nowhere. No, earlier. It was like you went somewhere in your head. Did you have an epiphany or something? Hermione ducked her head and checked her field kit in an effort to avoid looking at him. Or something, she muttered. He gently took her elbow and smiled. Want to come to interviews with me? His touch burned up the skin of her arm and settled in her chest. No, lab tests, evidence. With that, she quickly disapparated with a pop. Spliff lab. Dr. Granger, there seems to be something lodged in the nick of the interior aspects of the xiphoid process. Malcolm held up a small arrowhead-shaped bone usually situated at the base of the sternum. Hermione paused in her examination of the skull and leaned over to see where Malcolm was indicating. Swap for a sample and send it to be analyzed. Can I posit a scenario? Malcolm knew Hermione was not a fan of conjecture and was surprised when she nodded. The sample has a reflective surface. Based on where the nick is situated, I believe that this victim was autopsied after death. The skull shows the same microfracturing as the other victim as well. Hermione placed the skull on the table. Malcolm, does your scenario suggest a serial killer? Malcolm shook his head. I was required to take a psychology credit as part of my undergrad, which was superfluous. As we all know, psychology isn't a real science and should be relegated to the humanities building with the other soft subjects. He noticed that Hermione's lips had tightened in annoyance. "But I digress. My point is that psychology points to the ritual being a vital component to a serial killer. Victims often share resemblance. The disposal is often done in a way that shows reverence. These victims were literally thrown away." "I think we should leave that kind of conjecture to the Aurors. Our job is not to discover why, but how." Malcolm nodded and turned away to take the sample as instructed. He hesitated and turned back to Hermione. "Yes, Malcolm." Hermione was holding a humorous bone close to her face, the magnifying goggles on her head making her eyes appear comically big.
"Will Auror Inspector Malfoy be coming to the lab later?"
"As much as I try to discourage him, he does make a habit of showing up. Why?"
"My roommate believes he keeps coming here because he's enamored with you."
Hermione fumbled her grip on the bone and recovered enough to glare at Malcolm. "Auror Inspector Malfoy comes to the lab for updates on forensic evidence for active cases. I'd appreciate it if you and your roommate refrain from gossiping about him and his alleged motivations for coming here." Suitably chastised, Malcolm left the examination area and retreated to one of the smaller labs. She was the only forensic scientist working in the magical world, which made her skills invaluable in helping him solve his cases. At least that's how she rationalized his behavior. Her own, on the other hand, was extremely questionable. Why was she suddenly having these dreams about him? Hermione couldn't recall any previous attraction to him. Was it because between the war and now he'd grown into the kind of man she could respect? But respect didn't breed physical attraction. If it did, she would have lost it after most of her university professors. No, maybe it was because she hadn't had a date since she'd ended her last relationship about a year. No, wait. 3 years ago. It had been as long since she'd had sex, too. Not that sex had been on her mind, as she'd spent the last 3 years working all hours to establish Spliff and make sure the lab got the recognition it deserved. Could it be that now her life had settled into a routine, some treacherous part of her psyche was acting up with the dreams? If that was the case, she needed to find another big project to occupy her mind above and beyond the case and her other paper. Maybe a year teaching abroad would be good. Or, supplied a tiny voice in her mind, she could give in and act on her desires. Maybe propose a purely physical arrangement to Malfoy until the dreams stop. What could be worse than him rejecting her? He may accept. He may not be discreet about it, and then her reputation would be ruined. She'd never publish again. Spliff would be shut down, and she'd be a professional pariah. All for an orgasm. It just wasn't worth it. A feline-shaped Patronus jumped onto the remains, startling Hermione from her downward spiral into panic.
"Granger, I need you here before I curse those sodding Muggle authorities."
With a resigned sigh, she dropped off her lab coat in her office and flew to the ministry. Chapter 4. A stakeout is totally a hot date.
"It's good to know magic isn't infallible. There's no way they could have been identified if they didn't exist in the magical world."
Hermione stopped just outside the door to Malfoy's office, the voices masculine and sharp with defensiveness.
"Why are you killing us off again? Got another bad seed rearing its head?"
A third voice spoke up.
2 isolated instances do not equate to a mass murder from our side. How do we know one of your kind isn't in on it?
Draco's voice could have cut glass, his tone sharp as a diamond. Hermione knocked on the door.
"Come,"
called Draco, which was really a poor choice of word when it came to her state of mind these days. She shook her head to chase away the echo of his voice from her dream. She pushed open the door and entered his office. Draco was standing behind his desk, hands on the surface, as if it was grounding him from launching into a murderous attack. 2 men stood across from him. One man wore a black suit and tie, his hair neatly combed, and was slight in stature. He wore thick-rimmed glasses on his nose. The other stood almost as tall as Draco, wore jeans and a leather jacket. His hair was an unkempt mop of black curls that reminded Hermione of Harry.
"Ah, you're here. Excellent."
Malfoy's demeanor changed as he greeted her. He stepped from behind his desk to stand next to her as if to protect her from the men.
"Granger, I'd like you to meet our Muggle liaisons. D.I. Hastings,"
he gestured to the bespectacled detective inspector,
"and D.C.I. Hale."
The detective chief inspector turned and raised his eyebrows at her appearance.
"If all the witches here are this pretty, I may put in for a transfer."
he said to his colleague, eyeing Hermione in a way that made her feel as if he were undressing her in front of them. Do I need to remind you that you are our guests, and as such you will afford us the courtesy as your hosts?
D.A. Hastings nudged his partner with his elbow. I apologize for my partner. You must be Dr. Granger.
He extended his hand. Hermione shook it politely, but stayed next to Malfoy. Yes, this is our forensic expert. He kept his glare aimed at D.C.I. Hale.
Shall we have a seat and discuss the case?
D.I. Hastings attempted to ease the tension in the room.
Yes, the case.
D.C.I. Hale finally looked away from his staring contest with Malfoy and sank into a nearby seat next to D.I. Hastings. Malfoy ushered Hermione into his desk chair, but remained standing. She could see his hand twitch where it had settled close to his wound.
Dr. Granger?
D.I. Hastings pulled out a sleek-looking tablet and tapped the screen randomly for a few moments.
Can you share your findings with us?
Who are they? Hermione asked instead.
Does it matter?
D.C.I. Hale leaned back in his chair, adjusting his leather jacket. She caught a glimpse of a black button-up beneath it. Of course it matters. I know the name of every victim I examine. That's why I do what I do. Victims matter, and they need their names. Their families need to be told.
Yes, okay. No need to get emotional about it.
D.C.I. Hale waved his hand and nodded towards D.I. Hastings.
May as well get this over with.
Hermione glanced at Malfoy, and his stance reminded her of when they were at war and the wizards and witches stood poised along their lines, ready to draw and fire at a moment's notice. The muscles in his cheek twitched.
The first victim is Per Thanaporn, 24 years old, a second-generation immigrant from Thailand. She was reported missing 3 weeks ago. The second victim is Newton Obinya, born in Chiswick, 30 years old, missing for a week. D.I. Hastings read from his tablet and turned it to show them pictures of the deceased. Unlike Hermione's rendering, Per had her hair cut short in a bob style.
Any links found between them on your side?
Malfoy asked, his words escaping between gritted teeth. D.C.I. Hale shrugged.
Nothing we would ascertain. Last CCTV footage shows them boarding a train in the underground. They never got off. She was taken on the Piccadilly line, and he was last seen boarding the Circle line.
That gives us a common hunting ground, Hermione said.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with the tube, Dr. Granger, but it's hundreds of miles long. Thousands use it every day. There's no way we can narrow down one person.
D.C.I. Hale's tone was condescending.
Well, then you're not much use to this case, are you? Malfoy snapped. I'll send the paperwork along to your superiors, but I think your servers have reached their end. Now, just wait a second.
D.C.I. Hale stood from his seat.
Do you honestly think you're going to get permission to swan around our jurisdiction waving your little magic stick willy-nilly? We're the detectives assigned to this.
This is a magical crime that happens to involve 2 muggles. Aside from confirming their identities, you can't be of any more assistance. The killer, Hermione spoke up, placing her hand softly but firmly on Malfoy's wrist to silence him, is using a magical spell to kill the victims, but he's mutilating them using muggle means. His workspace may be in Muggle London. I haven't found any trace evidence to link him to a specific location, but his tools are surgery grade, and so are his methods. He kills them, cuts them open, removes all their organs, including their muscles and skin, and dumps them here. If he is using the tube as a hunting ground, we'll need the entire Met to find him.
I'm not losing any officer to some abracadabra,
D.C.I. Hale spat.
The moment he starts throwing spells around Muggle London, we'll be able to track him, Malfoy said. Still means having my officers in a line of fire with no way to protect themselves. I've seen how magic works, Malfoy. You're asking us to track someone we can't catch. I am happy to loan some of my best auras to back a team up. He doesn't kill them in Muggle London. Hermione's mind began to spin. He knows it was set of the tracing spells. He kidnaps them using Muggle methods, kills them there, autopsies them there, and dumps them back here. D.C.I. Hale stood up and motioned for D.I. Hastings to do the same. We'll keep an eye out for any suspicious activities on the tube, but this isn't a priority case for us. Because they're not rich? Hermione asked, standing up. Because hundreds of people are kidnapped, killed, mugged, and hurt in our city every day. This isn't the sort of case that gets noticed. With that, the 2 Muggle detectives left.
Malfoy turned to her, his brow low and his lips pinched, the tension of the conversation still clearly visible on his face. "Are you hungry?" It wasn't what she'd expected to hear from him at that moment, so she simply nodded. "Let's go get some lunch." Malfoy led her into Muggle London. In the side of an alley just off of Regent Street was a dark pub featuring wood panels so old and a rather impressive selection of beers on tap. They took a seat in a corner booth. "Are we here to find the killer?" Hermione leaned closer to him, keeping her voice low. "No, the fish and chips are excellent, and I'm rather fond of their Belgian beer selection." Malfoy motioned to the barmaid and placed his order. Hermione ordered the same, not really paying attention. "We could have had lunch in Diagon Alley." She examined Malfoy closely. His shoulders were still a taut line, and his eyes constantly moved across the room. "You want to provoke the Muggle detectives?" "They're hardly detectives, putting in the minimal work as if Muggle lives don't actually matter. If anything, it just proves that wizards are better." "Excuse me?" "When someone is killed, we don't dismiss it. We look for the killer. We punish those responsible. We don't let it go because it seems like a bit of legwork is required. If anything, they give this lot a bad name." He nodded his head towards the crowded pub. "It's a statistical fact, Malfoy. Muggles outnumber wizards in such a way that we have the luxury of being able to find criminals and punish them. Amongst Muggles, it's simply not possible to catch every single wrongdoer." "I can understand letting a petty thief go, but this is murder, Granger. Cold-blooded, premeditated murder, and they just don't give a fuck." "To be honest, I'm surprised you do." Malfoy turned his full attention to her. "The victims may be Muggle now, but the killer isn't. What if he escalates it to witches? I have to catch him." Hermione opened her mouth to answer him, but her phone rang in her bag. She pulled it out and answered it.
"Terribly sorry to disturb your meeting, Dr. Granger."
Malcolm's voice was tinny through the speaker. "What did you find?" Hermione nodded in thanks as the barmaid placed their beers on the table, but frowned when she noticed the woman wink at Malfoy. It's as if the world has forgotten what professionalism is lately.
"I may have found where they're being autopsied. I found trace evidence that doesn't match anything in the wizarding world. Things like oil and metal shavings and asbestos. At best guess, some sort of factory."
"We don't guess, Malcolm. I need specifics."
"An old factory, given how asbestos is banned. There was also some chemical residue found on the metal shard in the xiphoid process, molecularly similar to water found in the Thames."
"That really narrows it down," Malfoy said, surprising Hermione at his proximity. He leaned closer, trying to speak into the phone.
"I don't need to find a fish in a river, Malcolm. Narrow it down."
Malcolm squeaked at Malfoy's tone.
"Canning Town, that's the closest I can get to the exact site."
Malfoy removed Hermione's phone from her hand and pressed the screen to end the call.
"I suggest we chop and take a trip down to Canning Town."
"That was really unnecessary." Hermione sipped her beer. "Malcolm's already scared of you."
"I don't see why he should be. I haven't even threatened to curse him yet."
He ducked into the fish and chips that had been delivered to their table. "You're enjoying this? You want the detectives to catch us there?"
"I'm doing nothing wrong, Granger. We are having an innocent lunch and then a field trip. Nothing to do with the case."
"That they can prove. I don't know why you let them provoke you." Malfoy lowered his knife and fork and looked her in the eyes, his grey eyes pulling her in.
"They insulted you. I will not let it stand."
"I can handle a little misogyny, Malfoy. I'm used to it."
"You didn't say anything to them. You just sat there. The Granger I knew would have at least thrown a curse or a punch their way."
"I'm not a child anymore." "Indeed. There are better ways to deal with men like them, and the best way to do that is to make them look like idiots and solve the case without them." Malfoy's lips slid into a wide smile.
"That's an idea I can support. Now eat up, and then we'll go find a killer."
"How can a girl resist such a tempting offer?" Hermione smiled back at him. Hermione and Malfoy stepped out of the Canning Town tube station onto the pavement, surrounded by the bustle of Londoners going about their business.
"This hardly looks like a dodgy area."
Malfoy gestured to the hotels peeking out over the local shops and pubs. "Gentrification and modernization have its perks, but Malcolm said it will be in this area, so it will be." Malfoy headed towards the river, Hermione having to hurry to keep up with his long-legged strides. He led her to a nearby wharf that housed a few speedboats. Without stopping to inquiry about renting them, he simply jumped on the nearest one and with a little charm got the motor to turn over. "Malfoy, you can't just steal a boat."
"I'm not stealing it. We'll return it on our way back. Now hop on."
Hermione glanced around nervously, hoping no one would come storming out of any nearby buildings yelling about thieves stealing their boats. She hopped on board, and with skills Hermione had not expected him to have, Malfoy steered the boat carefully out of the mooring and into the river proper.
"The killer would use a boat,"
Malfoy said to her as he carefully navigated them along the edge of the river.
"The roads are too obvious and not busy enough to hide anything. Also, all the buildings roadside have been converted. Tell me, Granger, why do muggles need an entire street of art galleries?"
"Money laundering," she replied. "This whole area belonged to the Thames ironworkers until the early 20th century. Mobsters took over the docks afterwards, and now any self-respecting gang member with aspirations to riches uses an art gallery to launder their drug money. It's a perfect setup, actually." Malfoy was quiet as they slowly passed warehouse after warehouse, the boat chugging in protest at a slow pace. Across the river stood the O2 Arena. Hermione vaguely recalled going to watch a show there one November when she had the flu. She smiled when she recalled how awful her seat had been, high up and towards the back. Her boyfriend at the time had convinced her to go, and to this day she still enjoyed the band they'd watched. It felt like a lifetime ago.
"Here,"
Malfoy broke her out of her thoughts.
"this has to be it."
"It's a self-storage company."
"Which makes perfect sense, don't you think? We'll have to go in via the road, but I have a feeling."
"Feelings don't solve cases, Malfoy. Evidence does."
"Well, enter my feelings into evidence then. The bastard uses one of these lockers."
As Malfoy turned the boat around and began heading back to the wharf, Hermione felt the need to point out that the owners of the storage facility would not allow them to just search all the lockers, and that they would need to ask the detectives to get a warrant, and warrants require evidence. Malfoy smiled as he docked the boat and helped her onto the wharf.
"Have you ever been on a stakeout, Granger?"
"No, because I've chosen a career that makes better use of any time than sitting around all day waiting for someone else to do something." They walked towards the tube station, with Malfoy sporting an expression that Hermione couldn't really place, but if pushed would describe it as almost smug in anticipation.
"Cancel your plans for tonight, Granger,"
he said as they boarded the train.
"We've got a lot of work to do."
The last thing Hermione wanted to do with her night was spend it alone with Malfoy.
"You can't expect me to survive a stakeout alone, can you?"
Malfoy stood outside a block of flats directly across the river from the self-storage facility they intended to stake out. "Isn't this below your pay grade? Why can't Auror do this? Or the Muggle detectives?" Malfoy snorted at her suggestion.
"I am not going on a stakeout with Auror Caxton. She'll talk my ears off."
"You shouldn't have to do a stakeout at all, is my point."
"So what? I should spend my time in the office writing reports. Granger, I want to catch this psychopath."
"And I can help you by working the evidence, not staring out a window all night." Malfoy raised an eyebrow at her.
"And here I thought you had a hot date."
"I do, with the bones in my office."
"You need to look up the definition of a hot date."
"It certainly isn't a stakeout."
"Touché."
"How certain are you that he'll even appear tonight? Maybe he's still hunting for his next victim." This gave Malfoy pause.
"If I didn't know better, my feelings would be hurt by the insinuation that you don't want to spend the night with me."
Hermione spluttered as she tried to find the right words. She already felt the blood rush towards her cheeks. "Your feelings are not a factor here. I'm going back to the lab. Get your Aurors to do this." Malfoy huffed a sigh of exacerbation.
"Granger, please, don't chain me to a desk while I'm still young. Stakeouts can be a lot of fun with the right person."
"Or we can save ourselves the boredom and place a charm on the storage units to alert us of anyone magical showing up."
"You're such a killjoy, but I can't say that's a bad idea."
"I'm full of good ideas." As the words left her mouth, Hermione cringed. Malfoy stepped closer to her and murmured in her ear. The heat he exuded held a spiced mask that made Hermione's nipples pebble and a delicious shiver run down her spine.
"I'm sure you are."
"Right," she said, stepping away from him. "Now that that's decided, I need to go back to the lab." Auror Caxton huffed a sigh as she dropped into the armchair she positioned to look out the window of the stakeout department. Auror Inspector Malfoy said that would be fun, she lamented to Malcolm, who was seated in an armchair next to her. He was wearing a pair of sunglasses. Do you have a medical condition?
Excuse me?
The sunglasses. There's no sun. She gave an aborted wave of her hand towards the window, which had a stunning view of the river and Canning Town beyond it. Malcolm removed the sunglasses and handed them to her.
Try them on.
With a skeptical frown, she put them on and gasped. What is this?
Using these, I can see all the way across the river without causing a suspicious silhouette.
That's pretty smart.
Well, I work for Dr. Granger, and her first requirement is that her interns be very smart.
He said this plainly, as if stating a fact without a hint of arrogance in his tone. Auror Caxton whipped off the glasses and handed them back to him. It's not like Auror's training is a walk in the park, you know. The entrance exams alone require weeks of studying. I got the highest marks in my class, which is why Auror Inspector Malfoy personally chose me to work for him.
Auror Inspector Malfoy is enamored with Dr. Granger,
said Malcolm, feeling that was the safest answer to give.
You think so?
Auror Caxton's voice reached an octave usually reserved to drive dogs insane.
That's what my roommate posits anyway.
Oh gosh, this is so romantic. I mean, he's handsome and she's so pretty. They should be here, stuck in a flat together alone. The sexual tension building up until they finally give in to it and have passionate sex on every surface.
Malcolm scrunched up his nose.
This would be impractical. The strain hard surfaces puts on the joints will diminish the enjoyment of coitus.
Yes, but just imagine,
gushed Auror Caxton.
I'd rather not, thank you. That's my boss you're talking about.
Auror Caxton rolled her eyes.
Oh, don't be such a stick in the mud. It's not like they'll actually get together. Dr. Granger comes across a bit of an ice queen.
Oi, she's a professional and throwing herself at handsome men is below her.
So says you. I still think... She was cut off by the sound of Malcolm's phone ringing. He scrambled to answer it.
Hello?
It was a new phone that Hermione had given him earlier that evening, stating that she needed a non-magical way of reaching him while on the stakeout.
Granger, is this even working? Hello, Malcolm? This is Malcolm. Hand the phone to Auror Caxton, please.
Malfoy spoke slowly and over-enunciated his words.
He can understand you perfectly, Malfoy. There's no need to speak like that.
Malcolm heard Hermione in the background. He held the phone out to Auror Caxton, who took it carefully in her hand, cradling it like one would a tiny kitten.
Hello?
Her face was close to the screen.
Oh, Caxton, how goes the stakeout?
Nothing to report, sir.
Don't let the error go unwatched for a moment. This killer may use magic to conceal himself, so keep an eagle eye on things, said Malfoy, basically repeating himself from his briefing earlier that evening.
No, sir, eagle eye all night.
Auror Caxton gestured for Malcolm towards a self-storage facility.
Excellent. Check in every hour.
Will do, sir.
Auror Caxton returned the phone to Malcolm and settled back into her armchair.
Looks like our bosses are spending the night together.
Malcolm merely shrugged and went back to the stakeout. Malfoy, go home. He had been hovering for the past hour and Hermione was ready to kill him.
And do what, Granger?
Sleep?
I'll sleep when we catch the killer.
He moved from standing at her shoulder to the other side of her workbench.
What exactly are you doing?
Hermione clenched her jaw.
I'm running a microfracture scan to see if I can find the magical signature of the person who cast the curse. It's going to take a few hours for the results.
Then we have time for coffee.
No, I'm going home. Here's the phone to keep in touch with Malcolm.
She handed him the phone and removed her lab coat.
You can't leave now. What if he shows up?
Buzz my wand if that happens. Until then, I'm going to get some sleep.
She escorted Malfoy out of the building, locking it up and, ignoring his protests, disapparated home. To be continued. Thank you for listening to The Magic in the Marrow by Tygermine, read by Mabella. If you would like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, AO3, Tumblr, or Instagram.